Did you know there is a stretch of water on the edge of Chicago that runs electrified 24 hours a day, every day of the year, and that if you fall into it, the United States Coast Guard is forbidden by federal rule from pulling you out? Or that in a single week, 739 people died in this city? Or that the drinking water for nearly 3 million people still comes ashore through tunnels 2 miles out beneath Lake Michigan? Tunnels that men burned and drowned building in a disaster they tried to completely erase from history. Chicago sits at the center of the American century. The railroads, the stockyards, the skyscraper, the atom, the assembly line of the modern city. It is also the center of something nobody prints on a postcard, a long, documented habit of destroying its own people by the hundreds, and then burying the count. Most people picture Chicago's danger as a number on a crime map. Nobody counts the ones the city itself killed, by fire and water and weather and its own engineering. So settle in, because we are counting down 18 facts that will change how you see the Windy City. And stick around to the very end, because what we saved for last is documented, devastating, and somehow forgotten. Landing at number 18, the river that bites back. About 30 miles southwest of downtown, on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, near a town called Romeoville, the United States Army Corps of Engineers runs something that sounds invented: a wall of electricity, 3 barriers, switched on in 2002, 2009, and 2011. Pulse current through every inch of a canal 30 feet deep and 160 feet across, around the clock, without a single pause. They are there to stop a fish. Silver carp and bighead carp swam up the Mississippi for decades, and the only thing standing between them and the Great Lakes is this man-made canal. The same canal Chicago dug to reverse its own river more than a century ago. The silver carp is the one that makes the news. Startled by a boat motor, it throws itself clean out of the water, and downstate it has broken the noses and jaws of people in boats. Live carp have been found above the barriers more than once, in 2010 and again in 2017, close enough to Lake Michigan to frighten every fishery on the lakes. The state grew so anxious about the animal that in 2022, it gave the fish a friendlier name for restaurant menus: copy. And here's the part the Army Corps puts in its own documents. Inside that electrified zone, there is no safe way to rescue a human being. If you go in, no one is coming. Not a bystander, not the Coast Guard. Chicago electrified a river to keep out a fish, and in doing it, built a place where the water itself is off limits to anyone who might save your life. Coming in at number 17, the city founded on a body count. Here is what nobody taught you about where Chicago begins. On the 15th of August, 1812, in the middle of the War of 1812, the small garrison of Fort Dearborn, a wooden stockade that stood where Michigan Avenue now crosses the river, was ordered to abandon the post and march south. They got less than 2 miles. In the dunes along the lakeshore, a force of Potawatomi warriors attacked the column of soldiers, women, and children. In a matter of minutes, roughly 60 of them were dead. The survivors were taken captive, and the fort was burned to the ground the next day. The whole of downtown, the Magnificent Mile, the shoppers, the tour boats turning under the bridges, sits on the ground where it happened. Chicago likes to date itself from a fire. It should date itself from a massacre. At number 16, the air itself. On the 30th of January 2019, the temperature at O'Hare fell to 23 degrees below zero, the coldest reading in 34 years, and the wind chill reached 52 below. The National Weather Service office in Romeoville logged 52 straight hours below zero, the fourth longest such stretch in the city's recorded history. For about 2 days, Chicago was colder than the South Pole, colder than parts of Alaska and Greenland, by some measures, colder that morning than the surface of Mars. Schools closed, more than 1,000 flights were canceled, Amtrak suspended its trains in and out of the city, and the governor declared a disaster. In the rural counties west of town, the same air sank to 38 below, and set a new all-time cold record for the entire state of Illinois. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in roughly 15 minutes, and the Weather Service told people to stop breathing deeply outdoors to protect their lungs. Here, the weather does not inconvenience you. Twice in living memory it has counted the dead, and we are not finished with the second time. Fact 15. The bomb that gave the world a holiday. Here is what Hollywood never told you about the 8-hour workday. On the 4th of May, 1886, a labor rally in Haymarket Square ended when someone threw a bomb into a line of advancing police. In the chaos and gunfire that followed, 7 officers and at least 4 civilians were killed. 8 men were put on trial, though no one ever proved who actually threw the bomb. 4 of them were hanged, and a 5th died in his cell. The Illinois Labor History Society and the Chicago History Museum both keep the record. Out of that square came International Workers' Day, May Day, marked every spring by hundreds of millions of people in dozens of countries, from Paris to Sao Paulo to Beijing. It was born in a Chicago square. America is the one country on Earth that celebrates it almost nowhere and credits Chicago not at all. Landing at number 14, the day the L came down. The elevated train looping the downtown is the postcard image of Chicago. The rattling steel, the curve over Wabash. On the evening of the 4th of February, 1977, in the middle of the rush, a Chicago Transit Authority train ran into the back of another that had stopped on that exact curve at Wabash and Lake. 4 packed cars buckled, jumped the rail, and fell off the structure into the intersection below. 11 people were killed and more than 180 injured, still the worst accident in the history of the city's rapid transit. The National Transportation Safety Board traced it to operator error. Every postcard of Chicago has the L in it. Not one of them shows the morning it landed in the street. At number 13, the lake's worst day, and it came 60 years before the famous one. Just past midnight on the 8th of September, 1860, the steamer Lady Elgin was rammed in a gale by a schooner loaded with lumber about 10 miles out from the North Shore. She broke apart and sank in roughly 20 minutes. On board were several hundred people, many of them an Irish militia company and a brass band from Milwaukee, returning from a day in Chicago. Around 300 drowned in the dark water that night. The Winnetka Historical Society and the Wisconsin Historical Society both record it as the greatest loss of life on open water in the entire history of the Great Lakes. So many bodies washed up along the North Shore over the following days that homes and the brand new train depot were turned into morgues, and students from Northwestern University waded into the surf with ropes to drag people out, an act of rescue that later inspired the first student-run life-saving station on the Great Lakes. The disaster was so complete that 4 years later a new federal rule finally required sailing ships to carry running lights at night, so it could never happen the same way again. The wreck was found in 1989, and it is still down there. Chicago's lake has a graveyard in it, and the Lady Elgin was only the beginning of who was in it. The worst thing that Lake ever did, it save for the men who tried to tame it. Coming in at number 12, the summer the ground screams. Every 17 years, the soil under the Chicago region comes alive. In 2024, a brood of periodical cicadas the researchers call Brood 13 clawed up out of the ground across the area, in some places at densities of hundreds of thousands of insects per acre, filling entire neighborhoods with a single grinding drone. Entomologists at the Morton Arboretum and the University of Illinois had been counting down to it for years, because that spring Brood 13 surfaced at the same time as a separate brood farther south, a double emergence that had not happened since 1803, the year of the Louisiana Purchase. For a few weeks, the forest preserves around the city held more living animals per acre than almost anywhere on the continent. Then, they vanished underground all at once to wait, set a reminder for 2041. That is the next time Chicago's ground wakes up. Fact 11, the question Chicago never answered. In December of 1956, 2 sisters, Barbara Grimes, 15, and Patricia Grimes, 13, left a movie theater on the southwest side and never came home. Their bodies were found nearly a month later in January, frozen and dumped along a road at the edge of Cook County. The hunt for them, and then for whoever killed them, was one of the largest in the city's history, and the Cook County Sheriff's files on it are still open. Nearly 70 years later, no one has ever been charged. Chicago has a habit of leaving its worst questions unanswered. Hold on to that, because it comes back before the end. Landing at number 10, the Fallen 21. Here is what nobody taught you about the deadliest day in American firefighting before September 11th. On the 22nd of December, 1910, 3 days before Christmas, a fire broke out before dawn in a windowless, 8-story meat warehouse at the Union Stockyards. The Nelson Morris plant on the south side, its timbers soaked in decades of animal fat. The fire chief of the entire city, James Horan, was roused from his bed and drove the department's only motorized vehicle to the scene. As crews fought the blaze from a loading dock, a burning brick wall and the heavy wooden canopy above it collapsed without warning and buried them. 21 firefighters were killed, Horan among them, along with 3 civilians. To make it worse, the hydrants nearest the plant had been shut off to keep them from freezing. The Chicago History Museum still keeps Horan's helmet in its archives, and the city formed a relief committee for the widows and orphans those men left behind 3 days before Christmas, and a memorial called the Fallen 21 stands today at the old Stockyard Gate. For 91 years, no single event killed more American firefighters at once. It took the Twin Towers to finally break the record, and before that, it belonged to a Chicago meat warehouse most people in the city can't even place. At number 9, the one massacre Chicago tells too well. Here is what Hollywood never told you by telling you only this. On the 14th of February, 1929, 7 men of George Bugs Moran's crew were lined up facing a garage wall on North Clark Street and machine-gunned down by killers, some of them dressed as police officers, in a hit long blamed on Al Capone. The movies made it the city's signature image. You know this one. You can picture the garage, the brick wall, the bodies in a row. And that is exactly the problem, because you had never heard of the 21 people crushed in a stairwell, or the 60-some men who burned 2 miles out under the lake. That gap, between the Chicago that Hollywood sells you and the Chicago that's real, is the entire reason this channel exists. So if you want the version no one put in a movie, subscribe. It's free, and unlike a garage on Clark Street in 1929, no one on this team is going to line you up against a wall. And before we go on, remember what we saved for last. Those men under the lake did not drown in a shipwreck. They were asleep in a wooden building the city had anchored 2 miles from shore in January, with no lifeboats and a stockpile of dynamite on the floor. When the fire started, the only way off was the freezing water. You are not ready for what the record says happened next. Fact 8, the drowning that redrew the map. On a sweltering Sunday, the 27th of July, 1919, a 17-year-old named Eugene Williams was swimming off the 29th Street beach when he drifted across an invisible color line in the water. A white man named George Stauber stood on the breakwater and threw stones until the boy went under and drowned. When black witnesses pointed Stauber out, the white police officer on the beach, Daniel Callahan, refused to arrest him and arrested a black man instead. That refusal lit the city. 5 days of violence followed, much of it carried out by white athletic club gangs from the neighborhoods bordering the Black Belt, who drove through black blocks firing from cars. At one point, a white mob even tried to storm Provident Hospital, the nation's first black-owned hospital, where many of the wounded were being treated. 38 people were killed, 23 black, 15 white, more than 500 injured, and roughly 1,000 left homeless, most of them black families burned out of their houses. The Cook County coroner held inquest sessions 70 days and 20 nights running, and the Chicago Commission on Race Relations published the whole grim accounting in 1922 in a report titled The Negro in Chicago. No one was ever held responsible for Eugene Williams' death, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. The lake took 1 child. The boundary lines the city hardened in response are still on the map you use today. Coming in at number 7, the 38,000 under the neighborhood. On the northwest side, there's an ordinary residential community called Dunning. Homes, schools, a shopping center, streets full of families. For most of the 1800s and into the 20th century, that ground was the Cook County Poor Farm, an insane asylum. A place so feared that you'll end up in Dunning became a threat Chicago parents used on their children. It is also where the county buried its forgotten dead, the institutionalized, the indigent, the unclaimed, in unmarked mass graves, by some estimates, roughly 38,000 people in all. When crews later dug to put up homes and a shopping plaza on the site, human bones came up out of the dirt. People who study it call it the Tomb of Forgotten Souls. I have walked those blocks. There is nothing on them to tell you what is underneath. Chicago's way of handling a problem has always been the same. Bury it, build over it, and stop saying its name. At number 6, 21 people and 1 stairwell. On the 17th of February, 2003, more than 1,000 people packed the E2 nightclub on South Michigan Avenue. A second-floor room the city had rated for 240. Around 2 in the morning, a fight broke out on the dance floor and a security guard fired pepper spray into the crowd to break it up. In the panic, someone shouted that it was a terrorist attack. This was barely a year after September 11th, and the entire room stampeded for the only way out, a single narrow staircase with doors at the bottom that opened inward. The weight of the crowd pressed those doors shut from the inside. 21 people were crushed to death where they stood. The Cook County medical examiner ruled the cause compression asphyxia. More than 50 others were injured. I have read the building court file on that club, and the order to close that floor is right there, signed by a judge months before anyone died. It stayed open anyway. Police had been called to the address dozens of times. The owners were acquitted of involuntary manslaughter, though years later, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld a contempt conviction against them for defying that closure order. The building still stands on Michigan Avenue today, empty, with no memorial. A judge had ordered that floor shut. 21 people paid the fine the owners never did. Fact 5, the week that beat the Great Fire. Here is what Hollywood never told you. The deadliest natural disaster in Chicago history was not a fire or a flood. It was a week of weather. In July of 1995, a heat wave settled over the city and would not move for 5 days. The temperature climbed to 106 degrees, and the heat index, what it actually felt like on the street, reached 126. On the first day alone, the city's emergency lines took more than 16,000 calls. By the end of the week, 739 people were dead, more than twice the toll of the Great Fire of 1871. The Cook County medical examiner, Dr. Edmund Donahue, ran out of room. His office had 222 bays, and when those filled, the county brought in 7 refrigerated meatpacking trucks and parked them outside the morgue to hold the bodies. Most of the dead were elderly, poor, and alone, behind locked doors and sealed windows, too afraid of crime to open them. The sociologist Eric Kleinenberg, in a study he called a social autopsy of the disaster, later proved the city had a heat emergency plan that summer and simply never used it. Officials had forgotten they had one, and the dying fell hardest on the poorest, most isolated black neighborhoods on the south and west sides. The mayor was on vacation. He came back and told reporters his administration's performance had been excellent. The autopsies ran into October. The Great Chicago Fire gets a museum. The disaster that killed twice as many got a fleet of meat trucks and a mayor who said he did great. Landing at number 4, 20 feet from the dock. On the morning of the 24th of July, 1915, the steamer Eastland was tied to the wharf on the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle, loading workers from the Western Electric Plant, the Hawthorne Works, and their families for the company's summer picnic. More than 2,000 people crowded aboard. Before it ever cast off, the top-heavy ship rolled slowly onto its side in 20 feet of water right against the dock. Never left the wharf. 844 people died. most of them trapped underwater a few feet from solid ground in the middle of a summer morning, in the middle of downtown, while crowds on the bank watched it happen and could do nothing. Whole families were wiped out in a single morning. Some households lost 3 and 4 members at once. The Eastland Disaster Historical Society keeps the names. That is more dead than the Iroquois Theater Fire, Iroquois, and the Great Chicago Fire combined. It did not sink at sea, it tipped over at the dock, and 844 people drowned within sight of the people on shore who had come to wave them off. At number 3, the wall the company bought. Here is what Hollywood never told you. And in this case, a movie studio is the reason you never knew. On the 30th of May, 1937, Memorial Day, a few hundred striking steelworkers and their families, men, women, and children in their Sunday clothes, marched across an open field toward the Republic Steel plant on the southeast side to set up a picket line. They were met by 264 Chicago police officers, armed with pistols, tear gas, and clubs the steel company itself had bought and handed out, some of them sawed-off hatchet handles. As the marchers argued for their right to picket, the police opened fire into the crowd and then waded in swinging. 10 people were killed, most of them shot in the back as they tried to run, and around 40 more were wounded by gunfire. Among those beaten and hauled off were ordinary people like Lupe Marshall, a small social worker who was clubbed to the ground, and Max Guzman, a Mexican steelworker the police interrogated about his politics while he bled. A Paramount newsreel cameraman named Orlando Lippert filmed all of it, and Paramount buried the footage, afraid it would set off more riots. It took a United States Senate committee under Senator Robert La Follette, Lou Follet, to subpoena the film and screen it in Congress at full speed and then in slow motion, the first time film was ever used there as evidence. The room gasped. A Cook County coroner's jury still ruled the killings justifiable homicide, and not one officer was ever charged. Most newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune, first told the story the other way around, calling the dead a rioting mob. The police had no choice but to stop. That buried newsreel now sits in the Library of Congress. The camera caught everything. The studio hid the film, the jury cleared the badges, and the dead were the only ones who ever answered for it. Fact 2, the danger on the shelf. In the fall of 1982, 7 people across the Chicago area died after swallowing extra-strength Tylenol capsules that someone had pulled off store shelves, laced with potassium cyanide, and quietly put back. The first was 12-year-old Mary Kellerman, who took one for a cold before school. Hours later, a man named Adam Janus died. That same evening, his brother and his sister-in-law gathered at his home in their grief, took capsules from the very same bottle and died too. 3 of one family, one poisoned bottle. The pills had come from different stores and different factories, which meant only one thing. Someone in the Chicago area had been walking into pharmacies, poisoning the capsules by hand and slipping them back onto the shelves. Johnson & Johnson recalled 31 million bottles. Across the country, the case set off a wave of copycat tamperings, and for a while, no sealed product on an American shelf felt entirely safe. Within a year, the country had a federal anti-tampering law, and by the end of the decade, the Food and Drug Administration had mandated the sealed, tamper-proof packaging that is on every bottle in every medicine cabinet in America. One man was eventually convicted of trying to extort the company over the deaths, but no one was ever charged with the killings, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation case is still open today. Chicago changed how an entire country buys medicine, and it still cannot tell you who did it. Which brings us, finally, to the one danger this city has hidden best of all. Not on a shelf, not on any map, but 2 miles out, under the lake, in the water you will drink tomorrow morning, where 100 men once lay down to sleep and never woke up on dry land again. And finally, number 1, the grave the city drinks from. By the 1890s, Chicago was poisoning itself. Drank straight from the same lake it dumped its sewage into, and its death rate from typhoid fever was among the worst of any city in the developed world. The fix the city settled on was audacious to the point of madness. reach 2 miles out into clean water, and bring it home through tunnels bored 200 feet beneath Lake Michigan. The idea went back decades to an engineer named Ellis Chesbrough, who had first reached out into the lake for cleaner water in the 1860s. To dig the new tunnels, the city stationed crews of laborers out on the open lake, housed in wooden barracks built on platforms of timber and stone called cribs. One of those barracks, a temporary structure anchored about a mile and a half offshore at 71st Street, was put up by a contractor named George Jackson. On the morning of the 20th of January, 1909, while one shift slept and another ate breakfast, fire tore through that wooden building. There was almost nothing on board to fight it with. A few axes and some hand extinguishers that did nothing. And there was dynamite stored loose on the floor, and there were no lifeboats. The men were trapped 2 miles out in January with two choices: the flames behind them or Lake Michigan in front of them. Some threw themselves into the freezing water and clung to floating slabs of ice. Some jumped down the 180-foot shaft into the tunnel below to escape the heat. A city diver named Daniel Donovan went down into that flooded shaft in a rubber suit to clear what was left of them. One survivor was pulled from the lake, clinging to the aerial cable that ran back toward shore, one of his eyes knocked clean out of its socket. The tugboats Mumford and Sabin clawed through the ice to reach burned, half-naked men screaming in the water. Those who reached the ice found the cold finishing what the fire had started. Others struck out for shore across more than a mile of open, freezing lake and never arrived. No one knows how many died. The crib held more than 90 men, but the company had used day laborers it never bothered to write down. 47 bodies came ashore, most of them burned past recognition. The coroner, Peter Hoffman, convened a jury that settled on a figure of about 60, but because the company never recorded the men it hired, the true number went into the lake with them. Days later, a long procession of horse-drawn hearses moved through the south side and lowered the unidentified into a single mass grave at Mount Greenwood Cemetery, the largest public burial the south side had ever seen. The contractor paid for the funerals. He also, in the words of the newspapers at the time, ran a system of suppression, barring reporters, posting guards on the docks as the bodies came in, and fighting the inquiry at every turn. And in the end, that coroner's jury cleared both the company and the city of any blame. No one was ever held responsible. I have read the accounts of that morning, and there are two questions in them that no one will ever answer. The first is what started the fire. The official record calls the origin a mystery, and a mystery it has stayed for more than a century. The second is worse. We will never know the names of most of the men who died out there, because the people who sent them to die never bothered to learn them in the first place. In 2009, divers with the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago went down to the sunken wreckage the way you would visit a grave, and then the whole story sank back out of the city's memory all over again. Here is what makes it unbearable. That water system still runs. Chicago's drinking water still comes ashore through tunnels 200 feet under Lake Michigan to plants that serve the city and 118 surrounding suburbs, one of them the largest water purification plant in the world. 6 of those old cribs still stand out on the water, 2 of them are still in use, and one of them carries the instruments the National Weather Service used to forecast the lake. They are those squat stone structures you can still see from the lakefront, sitting alone far out on the horizon. And almost no one looking at them knows they are headstones. The only monument those men ever received is a small brass plaque at Mount Greenwood, added quietly years later by the Cemetery Association itself because no one else ever came to mark the grave, that reads, "In memory of Crib Fire. 45 unknown men. January 20th, 1909. Every glass of water in this city tonight comes ashore through a tunnel that men burned and drowned to build. At least 45 of them lying together under one stone that does not know their names. Chicago drinks from their grave and calls it tap water.